ringrazio la facoltà
I'm
di
also grateful to the Faculty of Philosophy at the Antonianum University for their continued invitations over the past few years for these seminar events. Today, I will discuss the Canticle of Creatures from a dual perspective, offering two journeys of reflection. This canticle is a hymn of praise that reaffirms the value of creation, highlighting a profound realism of the Incarnation. As we have often noted in our academic meetings, this realism carries a revolutionary significance. In contrast to the prevalent disdain for the world in the 13th century, the canticle celebrates positivity, beauty, and the contemplation of beauty. This beauty is synonymous with the good, aligning with the 20th century thesis by Hans von Balthasar, which posits beauty as one of the transcendentals. Transcendentals are properties that transcend categories and are conceptually challenging to integrate into discussions of the Canticle of Creatures. Despite their introduction in the 13th century in Philip the Chancellor's Summa de Bono, and later systemization by Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas in De Veritate, there remains a difficulty in incorporating the concept of transcendentals into the canticle. Nevertheless, these properties play a crucial role in our understanding and appreciation of the text. Additionally, the central theme that unites these reflections and takes priority is the contemplation of the beauty of creation, beauty itself. Through this lens, I seek to explore whether it is possible for the human to encounter the divine. I aim to analyze how the concept of beauty is expressed, beginning with the Canticle of Creatures. However, as you can see, this endeavor is challenging because it extends beyond the text itself. The two avenues of reflection I propose focus on the theme of beauty, emphasizing this transcendental category which transcends mere aesthetics. The first path explores theological aesthetics inspired by Hans von Balthasar's idea of beauty as a transcendental attribute. This approach involves developing a metaphysics of beauty, viewing it as a means of ascending toward knowledge of the transcendental. This includes experiencing beauty through the lens of Christian revelation as well as empirical beauty. We will also consider the concept of form or Gestalt, seeing beauty as a sensitive manifestation of the divine in ministry. This form of beauty is both free and elevating, leading the soul toward the good, a concept rooted in Platonism and Neoplatonism. This constitutes our first line of reflection. However, alongside this, I want to explore another, somewhat different path, the aesthetics of the ugly. This involves discovering beauty in negative terms, a kind of fall from grace for the concept of beauty. This path is centered on a prominent 20th century author known for his dialectic of the negative and his treatment of ugliness as a form of redemption, Theodore Adorno. Thus, I have outlined these two lines of thought for you. But let us begin with our primary text, which we have already discussed this academic year. The Canticle of Creatures is a hymn that celebrates the beauty of creation because it reveals the presence of God and enhances physical beauty. I want to focus on realism, which in this context is akin to Christianity and radical empiricism. This hymn of beauty is revolutionary, as it emerged during a time when the prevalent attitude was one of contempt for the world, tempus mundi. It was a time of crisis, marked by power struggles, rebellions, and heretical movements. As I mentioned, the concept of the transcendentals is important. Beyond the technicalities, is it appropriate to use the term ante litteram in the context of a text like the Canticle of Creatures? The transcendental defended the goodness of creation, particularly the transcendental beauty. The Canticle of Creatures had a revolutionary impact, counting the prevailing contempt for the world, contemptus mundi. We know that the future Pope Innocent III depicted the human condition with radical pessimism, envisioning a world in which humanity was deemed meaningless and worthless. To illustrate this, I quote Innocent III. I look, even the wise, the heights of the heaven, the extent of the earth, the depth of evils investigate. But what will they find in this vain occupation except pain and heartbreak? This perspective highlighted a dualistic, almost Manichaean worldview, reminiscent of Gnostic doctrines of the time. In the Canticle of Creatures, we clearly see its revolutionary character. There is a profound shift from the contempt for the world, as noted by many scholars, to a love for creation, emphasizing beauty, love, and generosity. When discussing beauty, it is essential to highlight the three passages in the text that illustrate this theme. In the second verse, we read, "Praised be my Lord with all his creatures, especially brother sun, who brings the day and is beautiful and radiant with great splendor." Here, the praise of God is intertwined with the beauty of creation, where cum has a casual value, enhancing the praise of creation's beauty. Another verse states, "Praise be my Lord for sister moon and the stars, which in the heavens you have formed, bright, precious, and beautiful." Again, the adjective beauty, beautiful, is emphasized. Further down, we find, "Praised be my Lord for brother fire, through whom you light the night, and he is beautiful, playful, robust, and strong." This reinforces the theme of beauty in the song. This theme of beauty is central to the Canticle of the Creatures, where Francis worships God through his admiration of creation. As I mentioned, Christianity reveals its profound realism through the incarnation of God, which grounds it in reality from beginning to end. Francis worships God through his appreciation of creation. We can see an intimate union between creation and its creatures. This sense of religiosity and spirituality is also evident in the documentary sources we have studied in our seminar, particularly The Second Life of St. Francis by Thomas of Celano, inspired by the theme of the mirror. I titled my talk Tertiary Mirror. In The Second Life, Thomas of Celano celebrates beauty as a gratuitous gift. He writes, wishing this happy traveler to depart the world soon. As from an exile, they found solace in the things of this world. He used these things as a battlefield against the powers of darkness and regarded them as a third mirror of God's goodness. Here, goodness is highlighted as one of the transcendentals. In every work, Francis praises the Creator for all that he finds in the creatures, always referring back to the Creator. He rejoices in all the works of the Lord's hands, perceiving in them the cause and reason that gives them life. In beautiful things, he recognizes the supreme beauty. The theme of beauty recurs, and from everything good, he praises the Creator. He who created us is infinitely good. It is interesting to see how a small gesture such as Francis urging the gardener to leave the uncultivated edges around the garden so that the green of the herbs and the splendor of the flowers can be admired, highlights aesthetic contemplation and beauty as gratuity. This concept of beauty aligns with the classical idea of beauty as a fruitful activity without utilitarian aims, an act of ecstatic contemplation, beauty for its own sake. It is more profound than utility, a truly rational activity. Thomas of Celano's reference to the mirror in Francis's canticle is particularly noteworthy. The mirror symbolizes a personalized icon, reflecting the presence of the person and the idea of man as the image and likeness of Christ. We understand that Francis's mission is essentially Christological. Saint Francis, seen as another Christ, restores the primordial beauty through his embodiment of Christ's mission, with Christ as the new Adam. This connection between the mirror and the theme of beauty underscores the profound relationship between Francis's spirituality and his appreciation of creation's beauty. A beauty that is not abstract, but is truly a manifestation of the beauty of the Trinity, the world and the human person created in the image and likeness of God. This concept is also evident in the vision of Saint Clare of Assisi in her letters to Agnes of Prague, a Bohemian princess who chose the way of life of the poor sisters of Saint Damien. Clare elaborates on these themes. Specifically in her fourth letter, she references the Book of Wisdom. This book, particularly Solomon's Wisdom 7:24-26, speaks of wisdom as the power of God, a reflection of eternal light. an unblemished mirror of God's activity, a reflection of His goodness. Here, the concept of transcendentals is also mentioned. Clare uses the metaphor of the mirror to illustrate the process of imitation and transformation in Christ within the community of the faithful. She writes, "The mirror shows the person of Christ, the bridegroom." She continues, noting that Christ is the splendor of glory, the brightness of eternal light, and an unblemished mirror. Clare urges, "Every day look into this mirror, O Queen, Bride of Jesus Christ, and in it constantly examine your face so that you may adorn yourself inside and out with radiant virtues, as befits the beloved daughter and bride of the Most High King." In this fourth letter to Agnes of Bohemia, Clare develops the concept of Christ's mediation in spousal spirituality, emphasizing Christ in the incarnation and passion. Again, a quote, "In this mirror are hidden blessed poverty, holy humility, and ineffable charity. By the grace of God, I could contemplate the entire mirror. Look carefully at the poverty of the one who is laid in a manger and wrapped in swaddling clothes. And again, the King of angels, the Lord of heaven and earth, placed in a manger. In the middle of the mirror, consider the holy humility, the blessed poverty, the labors and the countless sufferings he endured for the redemption of mankind. At the end of the same mirror, contemplate the ineffable charity that led him to suffer on the tree of the cross and to die the most shameful death." If we consider that this ecstatic contemplation of beauty is a contemplation of pure gratuity, we can trace the connection from the Canticle of the Creatures to our first path of reflection, the initial itinerary I would like to propose briefly. Beauty, or pulchrum, must be considered a point within the transcendental realm. As argued by Hans von Balthasar, not only should it be considered, but it should also be given very high priority alongside truth and goodness. This approach brings us to the conclusion that, at the core, there is unity. We recognize that in the works of Thomas Aquinas and Thomas, the transcendentals, including beauty, are interconnected. The failure of one transcendental can negatively impact the others, as Hans von Balthasar discusses in the fourth volume of his work, Glory. He argues that nothing can truly be good or true in the long term without the graceful light of gratuitousness and the beauty of inherent in the transcendentals. Without beauty, even Christianity would seem unnatural and lack its true strength. This idea is evident in the authentic lives of saints such as Saint Francis of Assisi. From the Canticle of the Creatures to the Glory of von Balthasar, we see that true Christianity would fall short if it were reduced to a system of exact propositions, focusing only on truth, or what is most useful and beneficial, focusing only on goodness. Saints who dedicated their lives to the greater glory of God, also upheld beauty. Von Balthasar thus affirms the pulchrum as a transcendental, making it a crucial metaphysical issue. What are the main objections to this view? Primarily, it is argued that beauty can only be considered a transcendental if it is shown to be independent of subjective or objective sensitivity. However, beauty is closely related to truth and goodness, as both are desirable: truth for knowledge and goodness for the will. Therefore, goodness and truth unite with beauty, which involves sensitivity. Truth, goodness, and beauty, pulchrum, are transcendental properties of being, encompassing all reality. Beauty is considered a transcendental in metaphysics when viewed aesthetically. As previously mentioned, Christian metaphysics, according to Balthasar, includes beauty as a transcendental. Balthasar himself attempts to develop Christian theology with a third transcendental in mind, aiming to supplement the consideration of truth and goodness with beauty. Transcendentals are inseparable, and neglecting one can have a detrimental effect on the others. We have discussed this already. How can one perceive Christian revelation without relating it to human experience? It is truly in the experience of beauty, seen as gratuitousness and love, that revelation becomes a visible and perceptible form. Balthasar asks, shouldn't Christians choose beauty as their starting point? In the first volume of Glory, he writes, our opening word is beauty. Beauty is the final word that the thinking intellect dares to pronounce because it merely crowns the indissoluble relationship between the dual pillars of truth and good with the ungraspable splendor. It is a disinterested beauty, in a sense, that the old world could not comprehend, which tiptoed away from the modern world's preoccupation with interests, surrendering it to greed and sadness. This beauty is no longer cherished and safeguarded even by religion, but when stripped of its facade, it reveals traits that threaten to become incomprehensible to humanity. Balthasar suggests that beauty, which we have created to believe in and now treat superficially, demands the same courage and decisiveness as truth and goodness. If we consider the pulchrum, beauty, as a starting point, it becomes a philosophical principle. In our journey, we have reached a point where, beginning with the contemplation of the Canticle of the Creatures, through transcendental aesthetic metaphysics and von Balthasar's theological aesthetics, beauty, pulchrum, takes precedence. We follow Balthasar in prioritizing beauty, not only as a transcendental but also as a more fundamental than the other transcendentals of truth and goodness. But why do the transcendentals co-belong? It is because if one transcendental is neglected, the others suffer as well due to their interconvertibility. As stated in the first volume of Glory, if even one of the transcendentals is neglected, the very essence of being is affected. Thomas Aquinas suggested that being is marked by a certain light for the body. But what happens when this light is extinguished? Because the language of light itself has been forgotten, and the essence of being can no longer express itself. Only a fragment of existence remains, and no matter how much it claims freedom, it remains obscure and incomprehensible to itself. When beauty can no longer be perceived, the testimony of being becomes unbelievable. The unique characteristic of beauty is its gratuity and splendor. A beauty free for pure contemplation. It also represents a method, beauty as a means of salvation, a philosophical method, a saving instrument. As Balthasar writes, the transcendental properties of being are so called because they affect the entirety of being. Therefore, they cannot be mutually exclusive, but harmoniously intersect in one another. Even for a moment, an ancient thinker could not have imagined setting boundaries between the transcendental beauty and the good and true transcendental. The circumincision among them means that the beauty of salvation, which reconciles and heals everything, also includes ethical integrity and the splendor of truth, even though the degree of this integration may vary. Transcendentals should not be separated from concrete and sensitive experience, particularly in the context of Christianity. We're discussing realism, which is based on the testimony of what witnesses saw, heard, and touched firsthand. This is why it embodies radical empiricism. Moving forward, we don't have the time to delve deeply into the initial reflections on Balthasar's theological aesthetics and the Gestalt. However, this unity of truth, beauty, and goodness also recalls and is indebted to what Pope Francis had discussed in his works from the early 2000s. He spoke of the truth of beauty, emphasizing its inseparability from aesthetics and ethics. For instance, in a text from 2007, it's important to note that Pope Francis had already developed these principles and their polarities in the 1970s. These ideas were later articulated directly in Evangelii Gaudium and other texts, addressing the co-belonging of the transcendentals in the challenge of being a citizen, 2007, Pope Francis states, abstract reflection risks focusing on abstract or appealing objects, dazzled by a sterile concept of truth, forgetting that the purpose of all human reflection is to engage with reality as it is. Therefore, one cannot separate the three fundamental elements of being, which philosophers call transcendental. Truth, good, and beauty must remain united. The citizen must cultivate a dynamic interplay of truth, goodness, and beauty. If any one of these elements is missing, being disintegrates and becomes idealized, losing its connection to reality. Among the principles we recognize is the superiority of reality over ideas. This realism, as analyzed by Massimo Borghese in his discussions of Bergoglio's intellectual formation, hinges on the doctrine of the unity of the transcendentals, the true, the good, and the beautiful. The breakdown of any one of these elements, truth, goodness, or beauty, can lead to deviations such as formalism, moralism, aestheticism, and an escape from reality. Pope Francis's debt to Balthasar is evident when he discusses the role of witnesses within Christianity, highlighting the interconnectedness of aesthetics, ethics, and logic within the doctrine of the transcendental being. The good appearing to us as beautiful underscores its imperative to be fulfilled. Many instances of abstract rationalism and moralism would disappear if they were linked to the idea of beauty. As seen in Glory, in a world devoid of beauty, even the good loses its attraction and the imperative to be fulfilled becomes less evident. In a world that no longer values beauty, arguments in favor of truth lose their persuasive power. Logical arguments become mechanical, like machines or computers processing data without deeper engagement. Balthasar emphasizes the perception of form, and through him, Pope Francis urges us to recognize and highlight the role of the witness through the aesthetic dimension of truth. It is a communication of truth and a practice of goodness that recalls the joyous manifestation of beauty. This realism and empiricism follows in the footsteps of Balthasar. Truth, to be essential, must become an existential truth that impacts us directly. This idea is present in other works and is a central theme in the mission of Pope Francis. Clashing with both Gnosticism and Pelagianism. The former is merely a self-referential formalism, while the latter is an inferiorizing moralism. Professor, you need to conclude now. All right, I'll proceed to the conclusion. The other line of thought we touched on earlier involves reclaiming beauty through the category of the ugly, considering ugliness as a form of redemption. We have 5 more minutes, so let me briefly address this point. Drawing from Adorno's aesthetic theory, as reinterpreted by Remo Bodei, and considering the forms of the beautiful, we find significant insights. Up to now, we have discussed an aesthetic beauty aimed at pure asceticism. However, within Christianity itself, there is also the theme of suffering. This was already evident in Hegel's Aesthetics, Hegel questioned whether Christ, as a suffering God, could still be depicted using the classical parameters of proportion and beauty. This introduces suffering as almost an aesthetic category, making the concept of the ugly evident. There is an aesthetic movement, but it is also a descending one, a top-down perspective. This is illustrated by Dali's painting of Christ, which depicts a view from the heavens downwards. What do I mean by this? In the aesthetic of the ugly, as explored by Rosenkranz and Adorno, beauty remains central. The theme of the ugly fits into the trajectory of modern ideas. Consider, for example, Kepler's comparison. He pondered whether the elliptical movement of the planets, being non-proportional, evoked a sense of terror compared to the perfect circle. The ugly thus enters our discussion, and beauty loses its halo, as Baudelaire would say. There is a transcendence between form and judgment, with the ugly asserting its own ontological autonomy, as Adorno posits. Now, moving quickly to address our remaining time, why discuss the aesthetic of the ugly today? Because contemporary beauty often becomes domesticated and kitsch. The ugly challenges this aesthetic domestication. To understand Adorno's aesthetics, one must grasp his concept of negative dialectics and how it differs from Hegelian dialectics, which aim for synthesis and progress, or Martian dialects, focused on class struggle. Adorno speaks of contradictions and dissonances, reminiscent of Schoenberg's musical approach. This is about a dialectic of the negative, a weakened negative reason that critiques and challenges rather than harmonizes. The Enlightenment is no longer seen as purely progressive. Its reason is being undermined. In Dialectic of Enlightenment, Adorno discusses how the cultural industry seeks to strip art of its autonomy, turning it into mere commodities within a market economy. This results in homogenization. To conclude, the ugly has a redemptive power because it resists the homogenization identified by Adorno in his time, the homogenization of the cultural industry. Art is in mourning, yet it expresses truth. For example, when Adorno discusses Picasso's Guernica, he references Picasso's response to a Nazi official. Who produced this horror? It was you. The ugly thus reproduces the real and holds a redemptive quality. Adorno talks about dissonance and realism, which bridges to our earlier discussion of the Canticle of the Creatures. We need to traverse the icy desert of abstraction to reach the philosophy of the concrete. Dissonance in Adorno's works best expresses the fractures of his time, Yet, the ugly can also contain a hope of redemption. The triumph of reason, according to Adorno, comes from denying conciliation and refusing to sublimate the ugly into beauty. The ugly forces us to see the world stripped of its presumed beauty, reduced to mere conventionality without conflict. Through unexploited reason, the ugly, the deformed, and the disharmonious carry revolutionary potential. We could see a revolutionary thread linking Adorno's concept of the ugly with the revolutionary character of Francis and the Franciscan thought. Franciscan love for creation transcends the contempt of the world, hinting an enchantment in a disenchanted world and suggesting possible conciliation in an irreconcilable world. Thank you.